When you hear the story of Jesus as it's told in churches, it comes across as if it's the most documented, the most certain, and the most undeniable set of events in human history. But when you step outside of Sunday school lessons and sermons and actually look at the evidence with a critical eye, the picture changes. It doesn't just change a little, it changes dramatically. Most people assume that the existence of Jesus and the details of his life are beyond serious dispute. They've heard over and over that scholars are in agreement, that historians back it up, and that only a small fringe of skeptics question the story. But that's not the reality. The truth is that there are many scholars, researchers, and historians from a wide range of fields who reject or seriously doubt the Jesus story, not just on one small detail, but on some of its most fundamental claims. And here's the surprising part. Their reasons are not always the ones you'd expect. It's not just about miracles or resurrection. Though those are obvious sticking points, the deeper issues are often about history, language, culture, psychology, and even politics. And when you line them up, you begin to see why the Jesus story falls apart under close examination. The first thing that unsettles a lot of scholars is the timeline. The Gospels, the primary sources for the Jesus story, weren't written during his supposed lifetime. They weren't eyewitness accounts scribbled down as events unfolded. They came decades later. Mark, the earliest gospel, is usually dated to around 70 CE, which is 40 years after the supposed crucifixion. Matthew and Luke followed with their own edits, expansions, and contradictions. And John came even later. Think about that. If someone today tried to write the definitive story of a figure who lived in the 1980s, based entirely on oral tradition, rumor, and secondhand tales, we would immediately be skeptical. Details would be distorted, events reshaped, and myths mixed with reality. Yet the Gospels are treated as though they're precise historical records. Scholars who examine them closely see the gaps, the contradictions, and the borrowed material. And it gets even more problematic. The story of Jesus doesn't exist in a vacuum. The ancient world was full of myths about dying and rising gods, saviors who performed miracles, and divine men who walked the earth. From Horus in Egypt to Mithras in Rome, from Osiris to Dionysus, the pattern is striking. Born under special circumstances, performing wonders, gathering followers, dying, and then somehow overcoming death. These motifs were everywhere. When scholars look at the Jesus story, they don't just see uniqueness, they see recycling. They see a familiar mythological template being applied to a Jewish setting. The virgin birth, the star in the sky, the miraculous healings, the sacrificial death, and the triumphant return. None of this was new. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Was the Jesus story truly history, or was it a cultural remix of existing religious patterns? But here's the twist. Even beyond parallels with mythology, the Gospels themselves show signs of creative storytelling rather than historical reporting. Many of the events in Jesus' life appear to be constructed from Old Testament passages, retold in a new form. For example, the story of Herod killing infants echoes the story of Pharaoh killing Hebrew children in Exodus. The feeding of the multitudes echoes Elisha multiplying food in the Hebrew scriptures. The crucifixion details are loaded with references to the Psalms and Isaiah. This isn't just coincidence. It looks like the writers were deliberately shaping a narrative that would resonate with Jewish audiences by drawing from their own sacred texts. In other words, Jesus' story may not have been remembered history. It may have been scripture turned into a character. And that realization has pushed many scholars to question the very foundation of the gospel accounts. Another reason scholars reject the Jesus story is the complete lack of contemporary evidence outside the Gospels. If Jesus really was performing miracles, drawing crowds, and shaking the political and religious establishment, we might expect contemporary writers to notice. But silence dominates the record. No Roman historian at the time wrote about him. No detailed Jewish source from the period mentions him. People sometimes bring up Josephus or Tacitus, but when you examine those passages, problems appear. Josephus, a Jewish historian writing at the end of the 1st century, has a passage about Jesus, but most scholars agree it was altered by later Christian editors. Without those alterations, the reference is vague at best. Tacitus, writing in the 2nd century, mentions Christians being persecuted, but again, this is decades after the fact and based on hearsay. These aren't contemporary witnesses, they're echoes of a story already spreading. That absence of evidence might not bother someone who approaches the story with faith, but for historians, it's a red flag. Events that supposedly shook entire cities, or natural phenomena like darkness covering the land, or graves opening, none of it shows up in records outside of Christian writings. That silence speaks volumes. And then there's the problem of contradictions. One gospel says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Another says it was during the census of Quirinius. Those events were 10 years apart. Which is it? One gospel has him preaching one sermon on a mountain. Another says it was on a plain. The accounts of his resurrection appearances are all over the place. Who saw him, where it happened, and what he said. If this were a consistent eyewitness record, those discrepancies wouldn't be so glaring. Scholars also notice the theological agendas shaping the Gospels. Mark portrays a very human Jesus, often misunderstood and suffering. Matthew emphasizes fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Luke presents a more universal figure appealing to Gentiles. John, the latest, turns Jesus into a cosmic being, almost entirely divine. The trajectory moves from man to myth. Each gospel adds layers, polishing the character into something larger than life. That evolution looks less like reporting and more like storytelling designed to meet the needs of different communities. So when you put all of this together, the late authorship, the mythological parallels, the scriptural borrowing, the absence of contemporary evidence, the contradictions and the theological agendas, it's no wonder that many scholars step back and say, the Jesus story doesn't hold up under scrutiny, but we're only scratching the surface here. There are deeper, more subtle reasons why experts reject it, reasons that don't always get talked about in mainstream discussions. And once you see those, the entire narrative starts to look less like history and more like invention. One of the less obvious reasons scholars reject the Jesus story is the political context. When the Gospels were being written, the Roman Empire was at its peak. Religion was not just a matter of personal faith, it was a tool of power and control. Stories about divine rulers, miraculous births, and godlike figures legitimized authority. Roman emperors themselves were often described as sons of gods, bringers of peace, saviors of the world. When Christianity began to take shape, it entered that world of political propaganda. And here's where it gets interesting. The Jesus story doesn't just resemble Jewish prophecy or pagan myths, it also reflects imperial language, calling Jesus the Son of God, the King of Kings, and the Prince of Peace wasn't just a theological claim, it was a political challenge to Rome's own slogans. It was subversive storytelling, flipping the empire's propaganda and applying it to a Jewish teacher. But over time, what began as resistance became assimilation. By the 4th century, when Christianity was legalized and then made the official religion of the empire, the Jesus story had been reshaped again. This time to support Rome's authority rather than undermine it. The very same narrative that might have started as protest became a tool of control. Scholars see this shift as evidence that the story was never fixed history. It was adaptable propaganda, molded to fit whoever held power. Another secret reason many scholars doubt the Jesus story is the problem of memory. The Gospels rely on oral traditions passed down for decades before being written. Psychological research today tells us that memory is fragile. People don't remember events accurately after 40 years. They reconstruct them, often filling gaps with imagination, expectation, or borrowed stories. If eyewitnesses existed, their memories would have been reshaped countless times before reaching the writers of the Gospels. And there's something else. The oral culture of the 1st century was not about verbatim accuracy. Stories were retold, reshaped, and elaborated for effect. Details could be added or dropped depending on the audience. What mattered was the impact, not the precision. So when modern readers approach the Gospels as if they're transcripts of history, they miss the reality. They're hearing performances that evolved over decades, and scholars who specialize in oral tradition can see the fingerprints of that process all over the texts. Another issue rarely discussed outside of academic circles is the silence of Paul. Paul's letters are the earliest Christian writings we have. They come before the Gospels, and yet, when you read them, something stands out. Paul hardly ever mentions details about Jesus' life. He doesn't talk about miracles, parables, healings, or even the nativity. Instead, His focus is almost entirely on the crucifixion and resurrection, and even those are described in mystical, visionary terms. If Jesus had really walked the earth performing wonders, gathering crowds, and delivering unforgettable teachings, why does Paul say so little about it? Some scholars suggest the reason is simple. Those stories didn't exist yet. They were later additions created after Paul. If that's true, it would mean the earliest Christians didn't follow Jesus because of his biography. They followed a spiritual figure, a kind of heavenly Christ, who only later was given a fleshed-out story set in the past. This idea, sometimes called the mythicist perspective, unsettles many believers, but it can't be dismissed. When you strip away the Gospels and look only at the earliest sources, the picture of Jesus becomes almost unrecognizable, more like a mystical figure of visions and revelations than a man walking around Galilee. That transformation, from a cosmic Christ to a biographical Jesus, looks to many scholars like invention, not history. Then there's the problem of translations and manuscripts. Most people think the Bible has been carefully preserved from the beginning. But the truth is that the earliest copies of the Gospels are fragmentary, scattered, and full of variations. No original manuscripts survive. What we have are copies of copies of copies, with changes made intentionally or accidentally by scribes. Some verses we take for granted, like the story of the woman caught in adultery, or the ending of the Gospel of Mark, weren't in the earliest manuscripts at all. They were added later. For scholars, this raises a serious question. If the text itself is unstable, evolving over centuries, how can we treat it as a reliable account of real events? The Jesus story may not just be embellished in content, it may also be altered in the very words used to tell it. Another reason that rarely makes it into popular discussions is the role of prophecy fulfillment. The Gospel writers repeatedly frame events in Jesus' life as fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. Born of a virgin, born in Bethlehem, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. But when you go back and read the so-called prophecies in their original context, something surprising happens. Many of them aren't predictions at all. They're verses ripped out of context, reinterpreted, and forced into the Jesus story. Take the famous "virgin shall conceive" line from Isaiah. In the original Hebrew, the word doesn't even mean virgin, it means young woman. The Gospel writers, relying on the Greek translation, reshaped it to fit the narrative of a miraculous birth. Again and again, what looks like prophecy fulfillment turns out to be creative reuse of Scripture. That's not history unfolding. That's a story being built on old texts. And finally, there's the psychological dimension. Human beings are wired for meaning, for pattern, for hope. Stories about saviors, redeemers, and life after death answer deep emotional needs. Scholars who study the psychology of religion point out that the Jesus story checks all the boxes of a powerful myth. It offers comfort in the face of death, justice in the face of injustice, and a sense of belonging in a fractured world. From that perspective, the story wasn't preserved because it was true. It was preserved because it was useful. It met human needs so effectively that it spread and endured. But usefulness is not the same as truth. A story can be powerful, comforting, even transformative, and still not be historical fact. So when scholars step back, they see not just one or two problems, but a web of issues: political invention, unreliable memory, silence from early sources, unstable manuscripts, fabricated prophecy, and psychological utility. Each of these on its own raises doubts. Together, they form a devastating case against the Jesus story as history. Another layer scholars point to is the issue of failed prophecy. Within the Gospels, Jesus is recorded as predicting the end of the age within the lifetime of his followers. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. That's not vague, that's specific. He was said to have promised a cosmic upheaval, the coming of God's kingdom in power, and his own return in glory. But that never happened. His generation passed, and the world went on as it always had. For scholars, this failure is more than a minor detail. It's a smoking gun. If the central figure of the story was mistaken about something so fundamental, it casts serious doubt on the reliability of the accounts. Later Christians had to reinterpret or spiritualize the prophecy to explain away the failure. But when you strip away those later rationalizations, what you're left with is a broken promise. And a broken promise undermines the claim of divine authority. Archaeology adds another problem. For decades, researchers have been digging across the lands where the Jesus story is set. And while archaeology has illuminated many aspects of the ancient world, it has not confirmed key elements of the gospel narratives. The census described in Luke, where Joseph and Mary supposedly travel to Bethlehem, doesn't line up with historical records. Crucifixions were common, but the burial of crucified criminals in rock-cut tombs like the one described for Jesus would have been almost unheard of. Details that are presented as historical facts often crumble under scrutiny. And then there's Nazareth. While today it's a real city, scholars debate whether it even existed as a settlement in the early 1st century. The archaeological evidence is thin. Some suggest that if it existed at all, it was a tiny hamlet with little significance. Yet in the Gospels, it becomes central to Jesus' identity. This gap between story and evidence leaves scholars asking whether certain details were invented to fulfill expectations rather than describe reality. Another quiet reason scholars doubt the Jesus story is the problem of contradictions between the Gospels themselves. Most readers notice small differences: one angel at the tomb versus two, slightly different wording of parables, different orders of events. But the contradictions go deeper. In Matthew, Jesus is born during the reign of Herod the Great. In Luke, he's born during the census under Quirinius, which happened a decade later. Both can't be true. These aren't just minor slips, they're historical impossibilities. And when it comes to the resurrection, the accounts diverge wildly. Who arrived at the tomb? When did they arrive? What did they see? Who did Jesus appear to afterward? The stories don't line up. If these were eyewitness testimonies, you'd expect consistency on the central claim of the entire religion. Instead, what we see looks more like competing traditions, each evolving in its own way. Another under-discussed point is the role of empire in solidifying the Jesus story. It's easy to forget that Christianity didn't explode into dominance right away. For its first few centuries, it was one of many competing sects and mystery religions. What propelled it to global prominence wasn't the inherent truth of its story, but the machinery of empire. Constantine's conversion and the later establishment of Christianity as Rome's official religion changed everything. Suddenly, this one story was not just encouraged, but enforced. Alternative views were stamped out, heretical texts destroyed, rival sects persecuted. From that moment on, the Jesus story wasn't just a narrative, it was law. To question it became dangerous. The dominance of Christianity wasn't proof of its truth. It was proof of its political success. And scholars today recognize that what survived was not necessarily the most accurate version of events, but the version that was backed by power. And there's another angle. When you step back and compare the Jesus story to other myths and religious figures of the time, striking parallels emerge. Stories of dying and rising gods were already widespread in the ancient world, from Osiris in Egypt to Mithras in Persia to Dionysus in Greece. The motifs of miraculous births, sacrificial deaths, and triumphant resurrections were common currency. In that context, the Jesus story doesn't look unique, it looks familiar. Scholars who study comparative religion often note that new movements borrow and reshape existing stories to resonate with audiences. The Jesus narrative may simply be another example of this pattern. A familiar myth clothed in local Jewish imagery, adapted to meet the needs of its community. And perhaps one of the most subtle but powerful reasons scholars doubt the story is the silence of history outside the Bible. We're told Jesus performed miracles, drew massive crowds, and disrupted society. If that were true, you'd expect contemporary historians to notice. But the record is almost empty. The references that do exist, like those from Josephus or Tacitus, are brief, ambiguous, and in some cases suspected of later Christian tampering. The overwhelming silence of non-Christian sources raises a serious question. Was the story as dramatic as the Gospels claim, or was it magnified later into something it never was? When you add all of this together, failed prophecies, archaeological gaps, contradictions, political appropriation, mythological parallels, and historical silence, the case becomes overwhelming. Scholars don't reject the Jesus story because of one flaw. They reject it because of the mountain of problems that pile up when you look closely. When you step back and take in the full picture, it becomes clear that the Jesus story doesn't collapse because of one missing piece. It collapses because every time you test it, another crack appears. No reliable contemporary evidence, contradictory narratives, failed predictions, political manipulation, mythological borrowing, and silence where there should be noise. Each of these alone might raise an eyebrow. Together, they dismantle the foundation. But what's just as important is what this tells us about belief itself. Stories don't need to be true to be powerful. Communities embrace them because they offer identity, belonging, and purpose. A story can become sacred not because it reflects reality, but because it answers human needs. That's why myths survive. That's why traditions persist. The Jesus story isn't unique in that sense. History is filled with figures whose lives have been exaggerated, reshaped, and mythologized long after they were gone. What sets Christianity apart is that its myth became the dominant narrative of Western civilization. But dominance doesn't equal truth. It only means the story won. For scholars, the task isn't to ridicule belief. It's to understand how these stories grow, why they endure, and what they reveal about human psychology. When they dissect the Jesus story, they're not just tearing down an old tale. They're uncovering the mechanics of myth-making itself. The way memory gets reshaped, the way political forces take hold, the way symbols gain meaning beyond their origins. And that's perhaps the most revealing insight. The very fact that the Jesus story can be explained without invoking the supernatural shows us something profound: that human beings are perfectly capable of inventing gods, miracles, and saviors, not out of malice or deception necessarily, but out of the deep human drive to make sense of the world. The rejection of the Jesus story by scholars isn't rooted in hostility. It's rooted in evidence. When the tools of history, archaeology, and critical thinking are applied, the narrative simply doesn't hold up. What remains isn't the life of a divine figure, but the record of how myths are born, reshaped, and sustained. And so the so-called secret reasons scholars reject the Jesus story aren't really secrets at all. They're there in plain sight for anyone willing to look. Failed prophecies, historical contradictions, political agendas, mythological parallels, archaeological silence. These are the fingerprints not of truth, but of invention. In the end, the story of Jesus is a reminder of how powerful human imagination can be. Powerful enough to create a narrative that outlives empires, reshapes cultures, and still commands devotion 2,000 years later. But power and truth are not the same. And when you peel back the layers, what you find isn't divine revelation. It's the very human process of storytelling.